Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Stitching Tales. I am Johanna Lundström.
And I am Malena Hjerpe.
And in today's episode, we're going to talk about a favorite topic of ours, which is sewing the perfect tee, or at least trying to get better at sewing knit tops. So we're actually both wearing our own patterns today, right, Malena? Because I can see behind the mic that you're wearing one of your sewing patterns, right?
Yeah, I'm wearing Malva tee right now, my latest pattern. So, obviously, when I was dressing myself this morning, I was like, well, if you are going to talk about sewing t-shirts, I have to wear a t-shirt that I made, obviously.
That's very good. And I'm also doing the same. If you're watching the video version, I should say also Malena is wearing, should I say teal colored?
Yeah, it's like ash blue.
Ash blue, yeah.
Yeah.
And if you, this is Malena's free sewing pattern, the Malva tee, which we're definitely going to link to in the description section of this video as well. And I'm also wearing one of my sewing patterns for knit tops, the girly top. If you can see, if you're watching the video version, it's a little bit, it has puff sleeves and a cuff. I'm wearing the short sleeve version here. So yes, we're both, it's going to be good to have this as a starting point. We can probably point, if you're watching the video version, we will probably point to our tops a bit just to explain a few things when we're discussing all the things that we need to think about when we are making knit tops. So I thought we should start with, it all starts with the fabric in my opinion. And Malena, what are some considerations when you are picking a knit fabric when you're sewing a top?
Yeah, definitely super important to choose the right fabric. And when you say right fabric, it's more like the right fabric to the top that you want to make or to the pattern that you have chosen. So it really goes like hand in hand, like those need to be compatible. Like there's no good or bad fabric. You just have to, it's more if it's suitable for your kind of project. So if you want to make a top, you need to first think about like what kind of silhouette is it going to be? Is it going to be a loose fit, oversized, or is it going to be a really tight fitted top? Because if it's going to be oversized and quite big, then you don't need so much stretch in the fabric. You can have a little bit stiffer jersey or knitted fabric. But if you're going to have a really tight fitted top, then you need to have some stretch or better stretch in the fabric and with also preferably quite good recovery. So you maybe actually need, if you have a really tight fitted top, you can't have perhaps 100% cotton. You need to have like 3, 4, 5, 6% elastan or spandex or lycra or whatever you want to call it. Because that's going to give you the stretch that you need, and it also will help with the recovery. So I would say, super important to choose the right fabric for your project, definitely.
Absolutely. And also another option, I guess, if you're using a very tight-fitting sewing pattern is to use a rib knit, because that has really nice stretchability as well. It can be 100% cotton in that case because it's going to expand, but also be aware that it might never stop expanding. so that's also a thing. If you're that's a benefit, right, of using a fabric that has some addition of lycra or spandex, is that it will have better recovery. Whereas if you use one of those really soft rib knit that has great stretchability, if it doesn't have addition, right, it has a tendency of maybe growing a bit too much when you're wearing it as well. So that's another thing I think to consider if you're picking a fabric for a very tight-fitting top.
Yeah, definitely. And also like different constructions of the fabric have better recovery and not. For example, single jersey, we call it, then it's like really like, I would say, that's the regular, the most basic common knitted fabric. So it has a right side and a wrong side. And that one is going to stretch a little bit. But if you have, again, like spandex or elastan in it, the recovery will be going to be great, and it's going to stretch out even better. But if you have, for example, as you said, rib, yes, that is super stretchy. But if you have, I'm looking for the word now. it has the same. It looks the same from the inside and right or wrong side. Interlock. Yes, thank you. That one is usually super soft. Very common when you have kids wear. Really perfect for like pajamas or something like that because of the softness. But the recovery is not so good on that one. So interlock would not be suitable, for example, a pair of leggings, because that's going to be very stretched out, and when you wear it, you're going to get, the knees are going to just grow and grow and grow, since that kind of a knit construction doesn't have good recovery. So that's also a really good thing to take in consideration, that what type of construction it is. And that can be a little bit difficult to just see, or if you are in a fabric store, and it can be difficult to know even like when you just look at it, because an interlock and a 1x1 rib, it actually looks really the same, but you can feel it on how the recovery and the stretchiness is. So in those cases, like, ask the salesperson, maybe they can help you and see if like this is suitable for your project, like explain what you want to do and see if what they say. And also I would say most indie patterns, they always have like fabric recommendations, like the weight of the fabric, if it's lightweight or medium weight, and how much stretch percentage is that the fabric should have as a minimum. And that is not, maybe it can be a little bit confusing because you talk about percentage, so you might think that it's like, oh, it should be the elastane percentage, but that's a completely different thing. So if you talk about stretch percentage, I, for example, have a minimum of 40% stretch on the fabric on most of my tops. That means if you have the fabric and you stretch it out, not by pull the most you can with the force, like decent amount, and then you measure that one when it's like when you have it flat on the table, and then how much you can stretch it out. If you can stretch it out by 30%, then it has 30% stretch. I felt that was really badly explained by me.
Yeah, I'm going to
too early in the morning for me now.
Yes, I'm holding in my hands now, if you're watching the video version, our book Fit for Knits, and we have illustrations showing just what Malena is talking about here. So I'm going to see if I can browse through this.
I'm trying to explain
quickly. So you can definitely, if you want to watch us on video, you can go over to the YouTube channel. It's linked in the description of this pod, but it's called Stitching Talespod on YouTube. And let me see here. I'm going to hold it up if you're watching the video version now. You can see here we have a stretch guide here where you can see the percentages and how to test the fabric if you have some type of measuring tool. And you as Malena says, you pull the fabric from a starting point, say 10 centimeters, and then you pull it out. And if it's 12.5 centimeters, when you have stretched out the fabric, it means that the stretch is 25% crosswise. That is. So hopefully you made sense. Otherwise, get our book Fit for Knits. It's a valuable resource if you want to make your own knit tops.
And a good thing to when you try that stretch, don't take just the tip of the edge fabric and pull it, because then it's going to stretch out much more than it will in reality. So like grab a big chunk of the fabric and pull, because then it's going to be more realistic result. And this is like the minimum stretch. So if you stretch it out more, that's no problem. Then it's just going to be, more comfortable basically when wearing. But it's more like a minimum. If it's going to be less than that, then the garment is going to feel too tight. You might still be able to use the fabric, but you might need to go up one size or two just to compensate that the fabric is not so stretchy. So just have that in. Really important to check it and take it in consideration.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. And now we talked about really snug fitting tops a lot. And there are some other styles as well. One, for instance, that I think we are both wearing today, which is tops that has a little bit of ease, especially in the lower hem. So it drapes quite nicely, because that is the because that's the kind of shape we wanted for both our patterns, right? That it kind of has this fluid shape rather than having a stiff, rigid shape that kind of stands out. Instead, even though we do have both some ease around the hip area, the fabric flows and kind of skims the body. So what type of fabrics are suitable for that kind of top styles?
So then this, for example, is viscose elastan mix. Viscose rayon, that kind of fabric that has a more drapey, it's quite heavy, so it's going to have a really nice drape to it. That kind of fabric is going to look really nice when you have those a little bit more, fluid shape. And for example, if 100% cotton is going to stand out a little bit more, it doesn't collapse drape as nicely. It could still, it's still workable to do this kind of tops, but it gives a different outlook to the whole garment with a drapier fabric. I personally love those kind of drapey fabric, but they can be a little bit tricky to work with. What do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree, especially when it comes to hemming and sewing the neckline. They are, as you know, the pros are also the cons, basically, because it's so soft and fluid. It's a little bit more difficult to control. So maybe if you were to make your first ever knit top, maybe a more stable cotton jersey would be easier to work with in a way, because you have more control over the fabric. I should also add fabric choices, because I would say most like cellulose-based fibers, for instance, you have bamboo, you have tencel. Those are also really soft, or lyocell, I think they call. Modal, I'm butchering, but they're like brand names of similar when you use fibers from trees, basically, to produce this. And also, if you have it, silk jersey, that is also a wonderful drape. Unfortunately, we are not living in the land where silk jersey is readily available, but that's also absolutely beautiful fabric to use for these kind of designs that we're talking about now. So I very much agree with you, Malena, that you need that softness for that kind of style. Otherwise, you won't get the kind of look that you're hoping for. Just we talked just about just a few minutes about this topic, but already we can see how much the fabric choice will influence. So just because you use a jersey fabric, it can produce so different results depending on what pattern you're using and what type of fabric you're using. But if you want to make a classic tee that has a little bit of extra ease and a little bit oversized, maybe, what do you recommend then to use? What kind of fabric?
In those kind of styles, it's actually maybe more suitable to use like 100% cotton fabric, a little bit more stiffer fabric, because if you use something like a viscose, it could still be really nice, but since the garment is then gonna be quite big, it's gonna be also very heavy, so it might feel a little bit like it's basically pulling down. So then a little bit more stiffer, not so stretchy fabric is going to be perfectly fine, especially for those really like oversized t-shirts. It's going to work really, really well. And this is something that we pattern makers talk about, like the amount of ease. So negative ease means that the garment is going to have a smaller measurement compared to your body, which means that the fabric needs to be stretched out when you wear it. So for example, my Malva top, it has a negative ease on the bust, so it's going to be tight on the bust, but at the hip it has plus ease, so the garment is actually bigger compared to the body measurement. So then it's I don't know if you say positive ease or like just plus ease. So that's a really good thing to always know. And if you're not sure, like if the pattern doesn't say, I always write like in my sewing instructions, like these, here are the body measurements and here are the garment finished measurements. But if your pattern doesn't have it, it's really easy to just measure your pattern pieces and just compare it to your body. And that's like the easiest way to see, like, is the amount of width for the hips, do you like it like that, or do you want it tighter or a little bit bigger? So then you can easily do some adjustments, like even before you actually make the garment. So that's a good thing to to know like what kind of ease do you prefer, because that's really a personal opinion, I would say.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I would also say that in those cases you don't need any lycra. In fact, in my opinion, sometimes that can change the hand of the fabric, because if the fabric has like a 5-6% lycra content, it adds a certain stiff, but it gets a bit more rigid. You lose a little bit of that soft cotton flow that you can get from a really nice washed cotton fabric, because it kind of has a softness, especially when you wear it many times, it becomes softer and softer. So actually it's probably a good idea, and it's also going to be easier to sew if you have a more stable cotton rather than having a stretchy, because you don't need the lycra. It doesn't fill any function if the tee is oversized. And you can, I think also, if you want to do like a tee that has very like extended shoulders and wide sleeves, you can also go like crazy and use like a sweater knit sweatshirt fabric, or like a really stiff thicker cotton, if you just have a pattern that can accommodate for the fact that, you know, you use a thicker fabric, so it needs to be a little bit oversized. Maybe the shoulder should be extended, the sleeves should be more wider, and of course plenty of ease around the body. So you can actually use, as Malena says in the beginning of this episode, you can pretty much use any knit fabric to sew a t-shirt. It's basically just to pick the right pattern to accommodate the properties of the fabric. So you can definitely use from the most light weight silk jersey to all the way to a rather stiff sweatshirt fabric, if that's your jam, because just pick the right pattern or adjust the pattern.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, like, for example, a Ponto di Roma, which is like really stiff, doesn't have basically any drape to it. That could be really nice as well on an oversized. It's going to be a little bit more boxy look then, but really depends on the fabric, or also suitable for a more tighter dress, for example. So it really depends on what kind of look you want.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so now we have hopefully like figured out, you know, how to pick the right fabric depending on what type of style you want to do. And now, of course, we should be amiss if we didn't mention the fact that we have written a book about how to fit garments, knit garments. And so fit is also important. Even though you're sewing with stretchy knits, you definitely need to consider a few things. And Malena, this is your area of expertise. So what would you say are some key points to get right when you're sewing a knit top?
Yeah, and again, here it depends a little bit on what kind of top you have. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the snug fitted, the little bit tighter, because oversized, that's a little bit different. So now just to, so you know what I'm talking about. So we have a more tight fitted top. Even though, yeah, the fabric is stretchy, so some patterns I've noticed that they have more or less the same shape on the armhole front and back, and also the same shape on the sleeve head or sleeve cap front and back. And this is a little bit simplification from a woven pattern. Since jersey is stretchy, yeah, it's a simplification basically. If it has the same shape front and back, I would not recommend using those kind of patterns for if you're gonna have a more tight fitted garment. It's just not gonna be good enough fit, in my opinion. If it's oversized, again, then it's a completely different story. But since the body is different front and back, usually the shoulders are a little bit more towards the front, and you always, want to reach your arms more towards the front. You are gonna want to have a less width at the front, so to create less bulky fabric at the armhole front. So that's why the front armhole is more scooped out. It has a bigger curve basically, and that is both then on the body armhole and the sleeve head. So it's gonna be matching. And in the back, since you are, again, want to reach your arm towards the front, you want to have a little bit of extra width there in the back armhole to give you that extra movement. And the armhole, the sleeve head is going to be the same there as well. It's going to be a little bit more wider at the bottom, so it's not so curved. So for me, I think that's really important to have that kind of a shape on a t-shirt, because otherwise, it's just not going to fit you as nicely.
Yeah, and we talk a lot about this in the book as well, where we show the different shaping. And I just, if you watch the video version, I tried to to show one page of the book where you show that it differs. The front and the cap sleeve should differ for best fit and best movement. So, as you say, especially if you're doing more a tight-fitting top rather than an oversized, then as you say, it can be a bit more forgiving. So that's a very good start. So maybe you need to shape the cap a little bit different in that sense if you need to, but that's a very good point. Another thing you talk a lot about in the book as well is the shoulders. You say fit should start with the shoulders. What are you thinking when you say that?
Yeah, I mean, the shoulder seams are basically gonna determine the balance of the whole garment, more or less. And here again, like on my patterns, I have the same shoulder slant on front and back piece. That's a little bit of a compromise. Usually on the front piece, you can have a little bit bigger slant just to compensate to make the armhole front a little bit tighter. But I have done it the same now, just to make it a little bit more simplification. But again, if your pattern doesn't have it, that could actually be a good thing, because then the shoulder seam might actually lie a little bit like really in the middle on your shoulder. So yeah, it determines the balance basically. If your garment is if you have balance issues at the bottom hem, it's probably something to do with the top fit then. If you get the fit nice on the shoulder armhole area, 80% of the work is done, I would say. That's that's a main issue.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And you also talk about the value of doing samples here, especially if you want to try out a new t-shirt pattern, right? To do some kind of sample just to assert that the fit is a good starting point, right? So what are your recommendations if you want to make a sample before you cut into your more precious top fabric?
Yeah, that's a really tricky thing about making tight-fitted garments in a knitted fabric, because it's really difficult to fit along as you sew, as you can do on woven, for example. So yeah, it's really tricky. But if you have some, I always, when I see fabrics on sales that are like a good price, and I kind of like the stretch, I usually buy them just to be able to make samples of them later. And the important thing is that it has to have similar stretch and similar drape. It doesn't have to have exactly the same as your like real fabric, but kind of similar. So you will get an accurate view of how the fitting is gonna be. So yeah, I always recommend doing samples before, but unfortunately with knit, you kind of have to make the whole garment before you can actually fit it, which is also a little bit bummer, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's difficult to correct afterwards. Like if you sew with a serger or overlocker, for example, to unpick that seam and you can't make the garment any bigger, you don't have any seam allowance basically left then. You can make it smaller, that's easier, but yeah, you are very limited to what you can actually adjust afterwards.
Yeah, that's the bummer. It's the pros and the cons, because it's quick to sew, but it's also difficult to adjust, as you say. So yeah, it's a very good idea to do a sample, especially if you're switching to a new sewing pattern, because no two sewing patterns are created the same. There will always be differences, and even if you are familiar with the brand and you use another, maybe it has more ease or something else that wasn't exactly your taste, because it's, you know, every sewing pattern designer has their own vision of the fit and everything, so they can't unfortunately read our mind because exactly what we want. So we do, it's quite common actually to find myself, you know, doing small alterations, because we are all unique creatures in this world, so it's impossible to sometimes to get it right from the first try. So that's a very good tip. And speaking of fit, another thing that a lot of people ask about is bust adjustments on knit tops. If you have a bust or a full bust, for instance, or perhaps a smaller bust I should say, and why do people find this a struggle with knits? Because you would think that why would you need a full bust adjustment on a stretchy knit top? Because it just expands, right? So what's the point of adjusting for the bust? Yeah. I can't pronounce it. bust.
Yeah, no, the positive thing about knitted fabric, it stretches. So the fitting is gonna be, you know, more forgiving, since the fabric is gonna be stretching out and molding across your body. But the tricky thing then, if you have a big bust, is that the garment might be fitting you fine, but since the fabric is going to be so stretched out, drag lines are going to appear towards your like highest bust point. It's just how it is. So then you have to take a decision, basically, like, are you fine with those drag lines, or do you, like, is it acceptable or not? If you want to improve the fit, you can do a full bust adjustment also on a knitted garment, which is basically you add more width to the front piece. And here we have, in our book, we show a little bit, because it's so difficult to know how much width should I actually be adding. So if you make a prototype in scrap fabric, I actually recommend to cut open a little bit, preferably at the side bust, just to see how much width you actually need to add to make the fitting better. And you can also like see how much do I need to add, like where? Is it just over the bust, or is it also a little bit on the upper armhole? So in that sense, I always recommend to cut in the prototype. That's why we don't use the fancy fabric for the first samples, because then it's much easier to just cut and see how much do you want to increase. But there's a limit, I would say, to how much width you can actually add to the bust, because the armhole and side seam are going to be a little bit distorted then. And up to a certain point, it's like you need a dart or you need a seam to get like really good shape, even on a knitted fabric. So don't be afraid of adding dart or seams to your patterns, or choose a pattern that has it already, because it's gonna be game changer for the fit, I would say. Those drag lines are gonna be so much easier to remove when you have actual shape into to the pattern. And on this Malva tee, I don't have any bust dart on this one, but on the pattern Hazelhen tee that I have, then I have both for B cup with no bust dart then, and I also have it for D cups, and then it has a bust dart. So if you have a pattern that already has a bust dart, it's going to be so much easier to even make it even bigger by doing a full bust adjustment on the bust dart, because then you can actually increase the size of the dart then. And in our book we talk about, if you want to add a dart, like how do you do that as well, because it's not that common to have darts on a knitted pattern for knitted garments. But I recommend, and for your cardigan, for example, that one has seams at the front, and that actually is a hidden bust dart in there.
Yeah, exactly. Because princess seams are basically just the vertical darts, essentially. Yeah. So it's the same principle. It's just add a different type of seam line. So that's, if you study pattern making and you can see how you can like pivot the pattern pieces, it's fascinating to see how many different darts you can create by slicing the pattern pieces and move them around. It's a very, very fascinating puzzle. So you can have them, running from the shoulders, running horizontal, almost like a bust dart. It can be like diagonal, like what you call a French dart, which is upwards, and then you can have waist darts, and you can have darts that start from the shoulder, or you can have darts that start from the armhole and go down, which is another form of princess seams. So it's fascinating to think about all the ways you can shape the garment by doing that, by just adding that dart. So you're molding basically, because we are, as we all know, we have curves regardless of what type of body type you have. The things are happening on the body. We're not straight sticks, none of us. So that's what's so nice about understanding pattern constructions and alterations, that we can actually shape the garment. And if you don't have our books, we have some really nice free guide that you will find over at my website, thelaststitch.com/bust guide. And of course the link will be in the description section, which we have a sample from our book where we show how to do full bust adjustments and also small bust adjustments as well, and including also some sewing tips on how to sew darts on it, because that is also a little bit different, or a little bit trickier perhaps, than sewing a dart on a woven stable fabric. So really, really good to have that consideration if you're, because as we say, we're all unique creators, right? So it's very hard to get the proper fit around the bust area, regardless if you have a full bust or a small bust or none of the bust, none bust. So that's a very good guide as a starting point, and you can also get a better idea of what a book looks like and the instructions as well. So that's a really good point. Now we took half an hour just about fabric and fit, but we should also talk a little bit about some of the sewing techniques that you could employ. One thing that I think is very important is to understand the sewing order, because that's also rather particular when you're sewing a knit top compared to, say, if you sew a woven shirt or a blouse, right, Malena? Because we have a certain sequence that we start with, and the way I see it, and you can of course chime in if you disagree, but I should say always start at the shoulder. So you sew the shoulder seams first, and it's also important in most cases to stabilize the shoulder seam, because since we're using stretchy fabric, which is the whole point of sewing a knit top, there's a big risk that the seam, when you're sewing, it will be stretched out. So instead of having the shoulder seam ending where it's supposed to be on the pattern, you will probably have the shoulder seam somewhere down on your arm instead, which you obviously don't want because otherwise you would have picked that kind of top to begin with. So you can use either self fabric, or you can use fusible interfacing or clear elastic. There are also different methods. And by the way, I've done a video about this particular topic also on my YouTube channel, which I would try to remember to link as well. It's going to be a long list of links in this episode, but start with the shoulder seam. And then I always sew the neckband after that. Do you agree with me, Malena? And why should we sew the neckband? Why should the neckband be such a second step instead of doing it once we've sewn the sleeves and done the hemming and everything?
My personal reason why I always choose to do the neck making after the shoulder is because then I've just started to make the garment. The neckline is going to be the most visible part, and if that gets screwed up, then I have not done so much work on that garment. But that's a personal reason. The real reason is it's going to be so much easier to sew because you have not sewn the side seam yet. So the garment is going to be flat when you have it on the table. It's going to be... You don't have any sleeves there either, so it's going to be less fabric to deal with when you are at the sewing machine. And when you have done the neckline sewing, it's so much easier to have it flat open on the pressing table when you press the neckline, because you have to press the neckline afterwards. Otherwise it's not going to look good. And one thing, when you have sewn on neckband, like a rib or something, it could also be in self fabric. you sew both the shoulder seam and then the neckline. But if you do a binding on a cover lock or cover stitch,
cover stitch, yeah,
cover stitch, then you just sew one of the shoulder seam, and you sew the neckline or the binding at the whole whole neckline, and then after that you sew the other shoulder seam, right? I have actually never done this, but you have more experience.
That's the common method to do it. There are a few hacks and tricks where you can sew both the shoulder seam, because the drawback of that method, which is that you get quite a bulky intersection there with all the layers of both the binding and the shoulder seam. But yeah, in general, that's exactly how you do it. You sew it on the flat and then you close it. In my book, Master the Cover Stitch Machine, I show some other methods where you can avoid this happening, but it definitely requires a bit more, a different type of approach. But yeah, that's definitely common. And if you see, for instance, if you look at a tank top that is made in ready to wear, they usually have this binding. You will see that if the sleeve opening is binded, you will also notice that there is a bulky at the side seam, right? There's a little bit extra bulk because that's where the binding is meeting up. So they did that the same way as well. So it's a very common method to do it, absolutely. But it's a good point because it definitely changes things. So, and also
just with the again, as you said, stabilizing the shoulder, that is super important to do on any knitted fabric tops that has sleeves. On a tank top, you might get by with skipping that. But if it has sleeves, you have to have a stabilizer, because also when you are wearing it and you have sleeves, like the shoulder seam is going to be it's going to be pulled out, and it's going to be a lot of stress is towards that seam then. So if it's not stabilized, it's so easy that it starts growing even further, and that the seam is actually breaking. So that's why it's like so super important to have different type of reinforcements there. And if you look at your ready-to-made garments that you bought in store, I can guarantee you all knitted tops, like both jersey tops and also like, you know, heavy knitted garments, like they all have some kind of stabilizer in the shoulder. Like that's the common practice in the industry. So don't skip that step. I always use just a strip of the, like, how do you say, the fabric.
Cell fabric, yeah.
Cell fabric,
garment
yeah.
fabric, yeah.
Yeah, I just cut it in the other direction, so it's a little bit less stretchy. But you have, on your blog and YouTube, you have like several different other suggestions, and we talk about that in our book as well. Confession time, I've actually never done anything else but cell fabric. I get by with that perfectly fine. Or if it's like a really thick fabric that I use, then I just take a regular cotton or cotton elastan to have it as a stabilizer. But again, always then cut it on the less stretchy direction.
Yeah, very good point. And again, if you, as Malena says, if you look into a lot of ready-to-wear garment, you will actually see that they have used a piece of the same fabric as the garment. So it's a very common practice. And my personal favorite is using clear elastic when I'm sewing, like stretching it and doing like activewear tops, because I love the way it both preserves the shape and it also has great stretch. So I love that. And I'll also have the exact same width as the seam allowance on an overlock seam. So that's why I'm a big fan. And if I'm using interfacing, for instance, if I'm sewing like a cardigan jacket, I usually rely on fusible interfacing that just has a tiny little bit of give, because then you don't need as much stretch. So those are my personal favorites. And so, but we have, I think, as you say, Malena, it's both in the book and on my blog and on YouTube. There are lots of other options as well. So you don't panic if you don't have one of these notions that we're talking about, because there are so many ways to do that. But just do it. That's the most important thing. And after we've done the neckband and the shoulder seams, then what should we do then?
Then we should sew the armhole. So sleeve attached to the armhole. And yeah, as we talked about, like the shape is different. and also like how to know which one is front and back. If you maybe remove the pattern piece from the sleeve, and like how to know which one is which. Usually most pattern, I would say, have some notches here. Maybe one notch in the front armhole, so that's easy then to see how they should be matched. And it's a quite common thing in the industry to have 2 notches like close together on the back side. So that's a good way to know, is this a front piece or is it the back piece? So that's a good way to tell the difference. And we sew the armhole first before we actually sew the side seams. Because then after we have sewn the armhole, we can sew the side seam of the bodice and the sleeve in just one go. So that's one of the reasons we do it. And the sleeve cap has actually a little bit of negative ease. So it's a little bit smaller compared to the armhole. And I think we have talked about this in previous episode of the pod. But yeah, that's a common thing, that the sleeve should always have a little bit more negative ease compared to the armhole, just to hold in the armhole a little bit better, make it tight and nice fit in the front armhole. Because I think that's a really common fitting issue, that the armhole is too big at the front and it starts to gape. So that's something that I really always try to avoid with when I construct the pattern. Again, because we don't have a bust dart usually. That's why the front armhole is then a little bit bigger, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's also so much easier to sew it on the flat because that's what the technique is called, I think, when you attach the sleeve on the flat before you sew the side seams. And I think when you're sewing a woven shirt, it's quite common as well. But normally when you're sewing a blouse or other type of tops, you usually first sew the side seam of the bodice and then you attach the sleeves. But it's going to be so fiddly, and it's going to be a nightmare trying to align, because also oftentimes, because we're sewing with rather stretchy fabric with negative ease, the sleeve opening isn't that big either. So to me, I don't see any instance where that should be the preferable method when sewing with knits. And don't worry, you will get a really nice looking sleeves. It doesn't remove any of the end result. It will just as fine, and you will have a much easier time to sew, especially also if you're using a serger, because I think a lot of us, at least I have managed to cut into the fabric where it shouldn't be when I'm trying to sew attach the sleeve to an armhole. And if you do it on the flat, it will be much easier as well. So there are just so many pros and not really any cons of using that method. I know we talked about this in previous episode, and I think it's becoming more and more common, but back in the olden days when I was a young person, many decades ago, a lot of the knit patterns actually use the same method as a woven, where you sew the side seams first and you sewed it in a circle, but it was a nightmare to sew. So don't do that if you had that inkling, and now we hopefully did a good job of explaining why you shouldn't. And then, as Malena says, we sew everything in one go from start to finish, like in one sequence. And
I would say, before you do that, pre-press the hems.
Yeah.
You're going to thank me later. It's so much easier, because again, then you can have the garment flat open, like the sleeve hem and the bottom hem of the bodice. You're going to have them, you're able to press them when they are flat open. So it's just so much easier than to press them in that stage. And when you come to the actual hemming, it's just going to be so much easier when they are already pre-pressed. So don't skip this step.
Very, very important, especially for the sleeves. It's going to be so difficult, and you risk also stretching out the fabric if you're trying to, like, even if you have an arm sleeving or sleeve pressing board, it's so difficult. It's so difficult, and which brings me to a point we should maybe do a little bit of go back to the neckband, because neckband is probably the thing that people struggle the most with. And for instance, I also press the neckband fold before I actually join it together in a circle, because I again find it so much easier to press it exactly in the middle, because every time you've closed everything into a circle, it's going to be more difficult. And also, if your neckband, the fabric that you picked, has a tendency to stretch out, then it's good to lay the pattern piece on the neckband and check, and that you will see after you press it. It's much easier to do that when the neckband piece is still flat, because then, okay, it grew 2 centimeters, maybe I should trim it. So that's also a good reason to do it first, because there's just so much easier to check and you have so much more control. Also, a great point when it comes to neckband, which I think we addressed in previous episodes, and we talk about this in our book as well, is that depending on what type of fabric you are using for your neckband, you might need to alter the neckband piece. Right now, both you and I, Malena, today we're using self fabric. We're wearing tops with self fabric, right? So self fabric means that we have used the same fabric as we've done on the garment. We have used also for the neckband. So it's soft jersey fabric, not the rib knit. And Malena, if you want to use that, and your regular sewing pattern has the pattern piece is designed for a rib knit, what should you do to alter to make sure that you won't get a gaping neckline or something like that?
Yeah, good point. Because neckband is always going to be shorter compared to your neckline, and when you measure this, you shouldn't measure from like the edge of the neckline. You should measure where it's actually sewn. So, take away the seam allowance, then you can measure the actual neckline. And for ribs, you usually have depends a little bit on the ribs, of course, but maybe 75% smaller neckband when you the length is shorter compared to the neckline on the bodies. And this is because the rib will be stretched out when you sew it on, and then it will lay flat on the body. If it would be exactly the same length, it would, just stand out from the body. But if you use the self fabric, that one usually doesn't have equally much stretch as a rib fabric. So it would be, if you use the same pattern piece for a rib neckband, it will be a little bit too short. So it will be pulling it together and create drag lines towards the neckband. So this is not really a fitting issue. It's actually that the neckband it is too short. It needs to be longer. And for self fabric, when the fabric is 40% stretch-ish, I usually do the neckband 85% of the neckline. For my patterns, both the Malva tee and the Hazelhen t-shirt, I have pattern pieces for both rib and for self fabric when you have 40% stretch, because you can't really use the same pattern piece for all different kinds of fabric. And if you have a fabric that is even stiffer, then the neckband needs to be a little bit longer even then compared to 85%. But then again, the stiffer the fabric is, the more difficult you are going to have for it to lay flat. It's just not going to look as good. So if you have a quite stiff knitted garment, then in those cases I would recommend to actually use a rib instead, to not use the stiff fabric for the neckline. It's just not going to lay as flat and nice.
Yeah, because you have to think about the shaping as well, because the whole point, as you say, is that the length of the neckband is shorter than the circumference of the neckline. So when you stretch out, that's why the rib is going to lay flat. So it's stretched out at the bottom where it's attached, and then it becomes more narrow and narrower, and you won't get that same effect if you're using a very stable, heavier fabric that doesn't have enough stretch. So it will probably just stand out rather than lie flat. And I think another, which I really appreciate about your sewing pattern, as you mentioned, I think you're quite unique in this, that you actually offer neckband both for garment fabric and for rib knit options, so you don't have to alter it yourself. And also an interesting thing is that you also make if you're using a garment fabric, you use a neckband. It's on your pattern piece, I know it's often a slightly less wide, whereas when you use a rib knit, it's the the neckband piece is a little bit wider. Why is that something also to consider if you want to alter the pattern?
Again, like if you have a rib, it's going to be more stretched out. And then it can be also a little bit wider because it is so stretchy that it's going to really like shape nicely. But if you have a fabric that is not as stretchy, it's just not going to show the out, like, how do you say, the edge towards the body might lay flat, but then the edge towards the neckline, that might actually stand out a little bit, like that. So it's a little bit to compensate again for the fabric. The stretchier the rib fabric is gonna shape more nicely, then you can have a wider neckband. But if it's not so stretchy, you can't have as wide. So if you would have, for example, if I would have a 3 centimeter neckband here, the inner edge is gonna stand out. It's just not gonna lay flat towards your body. So you can't have, if you use self fabric, you can't have that wide neckband. Rib, you can get by if it's really stretchy. It's gonna shape more nicely then, but not in self fabric.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. And I think this could probably a huge revelation, I think, for many who is listening or watching to this episode, because I think that's one of the things that a lot of people are struggling with. Either that your neckband gets stretched out and stands up like you explain it, or that it creates like drag lines and puckers because the fabric piece is too short. So it's it's difficult to sew a neckband, and we talk about that a lot in other episodes and in our book as well, so we're not going to go in depth about all the techniques you can use to sew a neckband here, but it's definitely something you should do your research and make sure that you use the proper techniques, because I think that's a lot of reasons, and which we also talk about in our book. You if you do have problems with like puckers or that the neckband stands out, there are a few hacks, right, you can use, Malena, because using your favorite tool, which is steam. Lots and lots of steam, right?
Yeah, then you can press it so it lays more flat. And I would say you always have to press a neckline after you sewn it, like, because it's going to be stretched out, it's going to be a little wavy. So with a lot of steam and pressing from the inside, like from the wrong side, because otherwise you're going to get press marks from like shiny press marks. So yeah, always do that after you sewn a neckband. And just to compare it also with woven, then you have bias tape. And with bias tape, since it's cut on bias, then that tape is going to be able to be shaped. If you got just straight strips of a woven fabric, it's not going to have any shape to it. But with a bias shape, you can make it like curved. You can use it for curved shapes as well. So that's a little bit the same with the neckbands. Like since it's smaller, then it's going to be shaped nicely. And I actually got that question, like, well, why don't you cut the neckband on bias then, same as you would on a woven? And that's the thing with the knitted fabric. On a woven, it's the same on weft and like horizontal and perpendicular. So that's where you cut it on bias to get that shape. A little bit of stretch. Yeah. But since a knitted fabric is stretchy, and also it different, like the knitted constructions is different on horizontal and vertical. So that's why if you would cut that on a bias, you would get like, how do you say, those snagging drag lines. Like it's gonna be, you're gonna get a lot of drag lines when you sew it. It might be fine the first time after you press it, but then after you wash it, you are gonna get those bias drag lines basically then, which I've seen actually as a design feature on some garments. But no, that's why don't cut it on the bias, is because it's gonna stretch differently in the different horizontal and vertical way then. So cut it along the more stretchy way of the fabric.
That's really interesting, because I've thought about this too, and I never heard this explained before. I mean, obviously, you think as a sewer you don't really need to, because you get the stretch anyways. And as you say, when you use a woven fabric, that's the only way to get some stretch, is to cut it on the bias. Because because stretch knits are stretchy by default, so you don't need to cut it on the bias. But never thought about the fact that it alters the stretch and the drag line, so you get another type of effect that is probably not always desirable.
Because the fabric is different. Usually it's different when you stretch it horizontally and vertically. It has different amount of stretch because it looks different in those ways, like the way the fabric is constructed, since it's knitted.
Yeah, because it looks totally different. Knitted and woven are not the same. we know that you all know this, but it's very important to remember. That's why we also talk about you can't use the selvage, because there is no selvage technically on most knit fabrics. So it's just a different way of doing it. And they also knit it on the round for the most part as well. So that's also a good thing to know. We should just maybe briefly, before we end this episode, also talk a little bit about the type of stitch types, right, when you're sewing a t-shirt. So you basically have two options, which is using your sewing machine to sew the side seam, or a serger or overlocker, depending on where in the world you live. What type of stitch would you use if you have a serger, Malena, for sewing the seams of a t-shirt?
With the serger, I mean, just the regular settings, I would say. Like, that's really...
Do you use
that's what it's made for, basically.
Yeah. Do you use the 3-thread overlock or the 4-thread overlock?
I always use the 4. I think that gives a little bit more stretch to the seam, and also more durable. It's stronger, basically.
Yeah. I usually do the same as well. Just sometimes I use the 3-thread if I want to reduce a little bit of bulk, because it gets flatter seam, especially if I'm going to top stitch over it, for instance. Sometimes, for instance, if I do attach the neckband to the neckline, and then I plan to top stitch the neckband in place, then sometimes I use a 3-thread overlock, just because I want to reduce as much thread and as possible. But otherwise, I totally agree with you. I think it's a great stretch, and it's a great stitch and extremely durable. I don't think I've ever encountered it popping or anything like that. So, and if you have a regular sewing machine, you can either use the stretch overlock, which done an entire episode on side seams and how to sew knits on a sewing machine. So if you haven't listened to that episode, which is episode number 12? No, 13. No, 13, yes. Episode number 13. You can definitely check that out as well if you haven't. And also for hemming, you have also a couple of different options, but you normally use your sewing machine, for instance. Probably the twin needle stitch is a good option, or a zigzag stitch, depending on the fabric. And if you have a cover stitch machine, you can of course use the 2-needle cover stitch, or the 3-needle, depending on what type of look you are going after. If you want to get a bit more advanced, you can use your serger as well. I've seen a couple of vintage t-shirts, for instance, using the serger blind hem, because a serger can actually sew a blind hem stitch as well. And they use the on the right side there's these ladders, which is like vertical lines of when you fold up the blind stitch, and that's part of the design. And I thought that's a really cool idea. There are lots of different options. We can't explain, but you have actually quite a few options using your serger as well. If you want to be a bit more adventurous, you can do like a flat lock hem with the folding technique, or you can also use a letter stitch, which is that curly wavy stitch if your fabric is really difficult. So you actually have lots of different options for hemming your t-shirt. So if you don't have a cover stitch machine but you only have a serger or a sewing machine, you can definitely achieve lots of different cool hemming techniques, and just not go outside the box a little bit for that as well. So that's probably an episode that's impossible to explain in a pod. I'm sorry. But
it will basically look like it's a cuff, sewn on cuff, like
exactly.
a very small cuff. So yeah, I have a picture on that in the sewing instructions, because I think that's it's a really simple way of doing a hem. There's not going to be any visible seam then from the outside, and if you have a really some fabrics are just difficult to sew with a twin needle or with the cover lock, then this kind of hem is actually preferable. It's easier to avoid drag lines. So yeah, it could be the easiest way to get a nice hem.
Yeah, and also another reason to check out Malena's free Malva T pattern, because you won't just get a free pattern, you will also get instruction for this really awesome way to do a hem on a serger that I don't think you don't see all that many tutorials, so that's a really great point. I also show a version of that in my book Sewing Activewear if you're curious, because it's a really good thing, and yeah, I love the look out of it, and you get all the great properties with stretch and everything. So just getting the folding right and even, and I think you're gonna be amazed with how easy this method is.
Yeah, and this is like the easiest way to activewear. If you know those like really stretchy fabric that you use for activewear, those are a nightmare to hem most of the time, nightmare. So this type of hem is by far the easiest then to get a good result. And then if you want, you can of course press the seam allowance towards, how do you say, upwards, and you do a nice stitch on that one then, if you want to have like a decorate seam or something, or a zigzag or something to hold it down. So yeah, you can easily like play around with that.
Yeah. So I hope that you found this episode useful and you got some new ideas for how to make knit tops. It's something that I think we will all encounter sooner or later, because that's probably what a lot of us are wearing these days. And again, all the things that we mentioned in this episode will be linked to. Of course, if you go to Malena's website, hazelhenpatterns.com, you will find a way to get the Malva Tee, which means that you subscribe to your newsletter, right? And then you get the free t-shirt pattern. And on my YouTube channel, you will have lots of different tutorials about the methods that we have talked about today on The Last Stitch TV. And also don't forget to check out the guide, thelaststitch.com bus guide. And of course, I will link to that as well. You can get hands on a free guide. So I think you have lots of resources to start with that are definitely going to level up your sewing skills when it comes to knit tops. So thank you so much for listening, and we talk to you soon. I am Johanna Lundström.
And I am Malena Hjerpe.
Bye bye.